I want to make it very clear that when people leave comments on the under the YouTube, I look at them, and sometimes I will leave a comment back, and sometimes I will I will answer with a YouTube. In this case, I'm going to answer with a YouTube video about Roger Waters. And somebody says, why don't you talk about him? Well, I don't talk about him because I don't think he's really that significant, and he's simply parroting the stuff from Jeffrey Sachs, but he's doing so in a much more agreeable way. He gave an interview the other day with a on a Greek channel, and I think his argument is deeply flawed, ranging from historical inaccuracies to logical inconsistencies and a reliance on sources that lack credibility. But he, for example, he says that NATO and the US provoked Russia into invading Ukraine. That's an argument that aligns closely with Kremlin propaganda, and it doesn't withstand serious scrutiny. I think it's worth asking why this is wrong. The myth of NATO expansionism as a justification is simply absurd. Waters recycles this, and Waters is little more than, I mean, he's a musician from a great rock band, Pink Floyd, but that's it. He's not an authoritative political observer or commentator. He recycles this Russian narrative that NATO's presence in Eastern Europe forced Russia to invade Ukraine. But NATO is a defensive alliance, and no country is forced to join. The former Soviet states like Poland and the Baltic nations sought NATO membership. Even Russia sought NATO membership out of fear of Russian aggression, not as a means to threaten Russia. Ukraine's interest in NATO was a response to the 2014 annexation of Crimea, not the other way round. And NATO also analyzes past events, and Russia is part of that analysis, by the way. NATO is essentially a force for responding, not a force for acting. And Waters' references to the Minsk Accords, arguing that the West sabotaged them. In reality, Russia consistently undermined these agreements by supporting separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, by adding their own paramilitary organizations. And I've talked about that in the past. And never allowing Ukraine to regain control over its borders. By 2021, it was clear that Russia had no intention of honoring the basic principles of Minsk. And Waters conveniently ignores that Putin himself had declared Ukraine a historical part of Russia and had denied Ukrainian sovereignty. This suggests that the invasion is about empire building. It's not a reaction to Western provocation. At several points in the interview, Waters describes the war as something the US provoked and prolonged, while portraying Ukraine as a passive victim of Western manipulation. Again, this is wrong. Waters' framing implies that Ukraine is merely a tool for NATO, ignoring that Ukrainians themselves overwhelmingly support resistance against Russia, and he disregards Ukraine's agency, portraying the war as a battle between the US and Russia rather than acknowledging that Ukrainian people have a right to self-defense. He criticizes Western arms shipments to Ukraine while ignoring that Russia has escalated the war at every opportunity, from the war crimes in Bucha to targeting civilian infrastructure on a regular basis and continuing to do so. If the West stopped aiding Ukraine, Russia wouldn't negotiate peace. It would crush Ukraine. And that is what we've seen in the last few days. Russia hasn't stopped attacking Ukraine because Trump stops supplying weapons, because Trump stops the intelligence sharing. Russia increases its attacks. So Waters praises Jeffrey Sachs, the Grey Zone, and other alternative media figures as sources of truth, while dismissing mainstream media as controlled by the lobby. Well, Sachs is an economist whose global whose attitude to the global war is widely criticised for being simplistic and pro-Kremlin. He's claimed that the US is responsible for the Nord Stream pipeline explosion without any evidence. The Grey Zone has repeatedly spread Russian and Chinese government narratives, downplaying human rights abuses in China, denying the Butcher massacre in Ukraine, using it as a credible source, is simply absurd. It's a red flag. Waters claims that Western media ignores his views because of the lobby, implying a Jewish conspiracy. This is an anti-Semitic dog whistle. The reality is that mainstream media does cover a range of perspectives, but Waters' views lack credibility and are often ignored because they are factually incorrect. And of course, people are going to give him airtime because of his role, because of his importance in the creative world. But beyond that, if he were just a boffin from the street, he wouldn't be given the time of day. Waters discusses Trump in a confused and contradictory manner, first calling him a buffoon and a failed landlord, and then suggesting that some alternative media figures like Gilbert Doctorow believe Trump is a brilliant strategist working for peace. Waters fails to mention that Trump undermined Ukraine during his first presidency, including delaying the military aid in 2019 that led to his first impeachment. And while Trump and that's because Trump's objectives are more important than the objectives of peace and of truth. While Trump has criticised Ukraine aid, he's done so not out of concern for peace, but because he sees NATO and European allies as freeloaders. His approach would leave Ukraine to be overrun. That is what is happening now. But Waters can't seem to decide whether Trump is a clueless idiot or a mastermind, and this inconsistency exposes his argument as not being serious. Trump is a problem. What he's already started now is causing Ukraine serious headaches. I think in the end, Ukraine will rise to the challenge. It will make the war longer. But Ukraine will not capitulate. Ukraine will not give in simply because Trump withdraws his favor. The blessing of Trump is not. This war is not about America. This war is about the survival of Ukraine. And yes, it has. America should have an interest in that, if America wants to be on the side of what is right. If America wants to do its own thing, fine. It's going to make life more difficult. It's going to mean people will no longer trust America. That's fine. Waters complains about the US veto at the UN Security Council regarding Palestine and connects it to his larger worldview that Western democracies are inherently imperialist and corrupt. And while Palestine is a serious issue, its inclusion in the discussion about Ukraine is a non sequitur, even if he's wearing a badge on his lapel. Waters is essentially saying the West does bad things in Palestine, therefore it must also be wrong about Ukraine. That's not logical. You can't necessarily. There are points of coherence between these two conflicts. Iran is one point, but you can't draw these conclusions like that. Waters ignores the fact that Russia also abuses its UN veto power. Moscow has vetoed resolutions condemning its actions in Ukraine many times. If Waters genuinely opposed the veto system, he would criticize Russia's use of it as well. And Waters presents the Israel-Palestine conflict as an extension of Western imperialism, ignoring the regional complexities, Palestine's internal politics, and the fact that several Arab states have normalized relations with Israel. The direction for the Israel-Palestine issue is towards a two-state solution. And we should be promoting that rather than adding further complexity. Waters may be a talented musician, but his interference in global politics is riddled with historical inaccuracies, like, for example, the idea that NATO provoked Russia, logical fallacies like his Palestine and Ukraine being proof of Western evil. No. His use of unreliable sources like Jeffrey Sachs and the Grey Zone, his conspiracy thinking, blaming the lobby for media science, his contradictory reasoning, that Trump is both an idiot and a mastermind. His worldview is built on simplicity, on a simplistic anti-Western binary where the US and NATO are always the villains and anyone opposing them, Russia or Hamas, is justified. That simply is not true. And this kind of thinking is not just misleading, but it's actively harmful, as it lends credibility to authoritarian regimes while dismissing the real struggles of Ukraine and of others who resist opposition. Ultimately, Waters is not an advocate for peace. He's an enabler of aggression. He's an enabler of revisionist powers. He's an enabler of conspiracy theorists. And his argument should be critically dismantled, not taken at face value, and he shouldn't be indulged, I'm afraid.